Okay, so now we'll be talking about the pressure volume loops in cardiac cycle. So if we take a look at the heart up first, the whole process of a cardiac beat starts up with opening of the mitral valves and tricuspid valves over here. So basically, what we have here is the actually this is the left atrium, this is the right atrium, this is the left ventricle, and this is the right ventricle. So the blood goes the normal way. It should go this way and then this way, and at the same time, after a while, they get pumped outside the heart into the aorta. This is the aorta, and then into the systemic circulation. So let me put this. And of course, between the two ventricles, we have the two um, uh, valves. The first on the left side is the mitral valve, and then on the right side is the tricuspid valve. But here we are going to talk for this graph is only it's talking about the left ventricle. So this is what happens in each cardiac beat in the left ventricle. So it's all about the left ventricle over here. So the whole process starts with the mitral valve opening. So when the mitral valve opens, it allows the blood to flow from the left atrium to the left ventricle. So supposing we have a healthy heart without any problem, that means the blood goes easily and nicely and peacefully without any problem from the left atrium to the left ventricle. And now that means the left atrium is started to have blood in it. So this process of having the left atrium filling the left ventricle is called the rapid, I mean, yeah, the rapid filling phase. So this is rapid filling because there's no problem. The blood goes down rapidly without any problem, so it's fine. And then after a while, the mitral valve wants to close because the left ventricle had a lot of blood within it, and it's fine. So the left atrium still wants to push a little bit more blood into the left ventricle, so it do a little bit of an extra effort of contracting more. So this additional harder contraction of the left atrium to push a little bit more of a blood into the left atrium before the mitral valve closes is called the reduced filling. So it's like a push from the left atrium to the left ventricle, so it can just push a little bit more blood before the mitral valve closes, and we lose the chance completely. So what happens is there is an additional amount of blood coming into the left ventricle through this reduced filling phase. So now after the left ventricle has completely filled, of course, the mitral valve is going to close. Okay, so there is complete closure of the mitral valve and does not pass blood anymore. And meanwhile, of course, while this was all happening, the aorta, of course, was closed because it's a closed compartment, the left ventricle. So no blood was flowing to the outside of the ventricle through the aorta. So now we are at the time where the left ventricle is filled with the blood and the mitral valve is closed and the aortic valve is closed. So it's a closed compartment. So now the left ventricle wants to start pushing the blood to the outside of it through the aorta. So what is happening is that this left ventricle tries to push um, uh, against the blood it has in it. But this pressure, this contraction of the left ventricle is not enough tough or strong enough to open the aortic valve. So there is an actual contraction of the left ventricular wall, but actually there is no outlet of the blood, which means that we are changing the blood, the left ventricle by contraction is changing its pressure, but it's not emptying the blood. So there is a change in the pressure without a change in the volume of the blood. So that is called isovolumetric contraction. Because isovolumetric, so there is no change in volume, but contraction, there is an increase in the pressure. So these ventricles, the left ventricle, and of course at the same time the same thing is happening in the right ventricle, but we decided we're only talking about the left ventricle now. So as this left ventricle keeps contracting, we are increasing the pressure to a point that is enough to open the aorta. Now the left ventricle is strong enough to open the aorta. So what happens is that the aorta starts opening, and when the aorta does open, that would allow the blood to flow to the outside of the left ventricle into the systemic circulation, and everything is fine. So, of course, this means this systolic phase. This is the contraction of the left ventricle, and there is complete emptying. The blood keeps passing out to the aorta until the left ventricle has fully emptied its content. But what I mean by fully is the majority of it here. Because the problem is, it's actually not a problem, it's something that is specific to the heart. The heart, well, it's a heart. Its possibility or its duty is to pump the blood to the all of the circulation in uh, pulmonic circulation. So of course, it will never ever be completely empty out of a blood. So there should be a small amount of a blood left in the left ventricle even after it empties its content. So this is the small amount of the left ventricle, a small amount of blood in the left ventricle, even after it has emptied all of its contents into the aorta. So because now the left ventricle, due to this contraction, had emptied all of its blood, then the contraction goes away and the left ventricle starts to relax. But meanwhile, the aortic valve, the outlet is going to be closed. So now we have the aortic valve closed, and then the mitral valve is closed as well. And we have only small amount of blood is staying in the left ventricle, and the left ventricle starts to relax this time. So it's only relaxing after the whole contraction that it did in order to empty itself. So now this relaxation or being calm is called isovolumetric relaxation. So it's the same thing. As a volumetric, there is no change in the amount of blood that has stayed in the left ventricle. So basically, the left ventricle is empty except for this little amount that stayed from the prior contraction. And it is also called relaxation because the cardiac muscle is just getting relaxed now and not contracting. So there is a reduction in pressure. So there is a reduction in pressure on the wall, but meanwhile, there is isovolumetric relaxation of the whole ventricle. So this is the phase that is called isoventricular relaxation. So now, of course, meanwhile, the pressure within the left atrium it was increasing because the left atrium is getting all the blood from the aortic veins over here. So it started falling until it has a high pressure, a pressure that is high enough to again go ahead and open the mitral valves in order to let the blood flow down to the left ventricle and create the whole circle again. Okay, so and then of course we know that this is the ventricular filling. So after the ventricles filled, there is the other thing that we said that we're going to have the reduced filling, that is the atrial kick. So after the left atrium has emptied all of its contents and they went into let me split color here. So if they're actually the red color is better. So after that, all of its content has gone down to the left ventricle, it still has something left and it still wants to push it. So it will use the atrial kick. So it's the last trial of the left atrium to push the remaining blood into the left ventricle. And then, of course, after the relaxation is done, after the filling is done, the mitral valve is going to close again. And now we have the aorta is closed over here, and then the mitral is closed over here. So there is an also again a ventricular contraction, that is the isoventricular contraction, and then the pressure goes high enough in order to open the aortic valves, and now the aortic valves are open, the left ventricle can push its content to the outside of it, and we have the same process over and over again. So the blood that was over here starts to flow to the outside into the aorta, into the smooth circulation, and of course we still have enough blood left, just a little bit of it in left after the contraction is done. So these are the basics of the cardiac cycle, and we were only talking about the left ventricle. So this is the left side, and the same thing goes exactly for the right side of the heart. But now we're talking in this diagram about the left ventricle. So this graph represents the relationship between the left ventricular volume and the left ventricular pressure over here. So this is the x-axis, as we know, and this is the y-axis. So if the graph goes to this side in the x-axis, this means it's going to be increased. The values are going to be increased because this is the zero number. Okay, and we have 1, 2, 3, and then there you go, bye. And then there's 1, 2, 3 over here. So if we go this way, there is an increase in the left ventricular pressure. If we go that way, then this is a decrease in the volume. If we go this way, then there is a decrease in the pressure. Okay, so the normal basic cycle that we're looking at is the black one. The black one starts, as I said, with the mitral valve opening over here. So this point in the black circle is the mitral valve opening. So if we take a look at the heart, okay, and we said this is only talking about the left ventricle, this is the left atrium. So now the mitral valve opens. So this is one, okay? Now the blood starts flowing from the left atrium into the left ventricle. So this is called 4 and 5. These are the rapid and reduced ventricular filling. So first we start with 4. This is the rapid ventricular filling, as we said. Here you go. This is it, the rapid filling. So the ventricle is filling easily and nicely without any problem. And then there is the reduced part. So here we go. This is the reduced part. It's the trial of the left atrium to push a little bit harder. And we have the reduced filling, the atrial kick. So until the whole filling is done, that's when the mitral valve closes. And this is what we said. After the whole blood accumulates, so let me use that right color. So after the whole blood accumulates in the left ventricle, now the mitral valve closes, okay? So the mitral valve closes because the pressure in the left ventricle is high enough now to close the mitral valve. And we also said that the aorta was closed as well. So now it's a closed compartment without any valves being open, and the ventricle now wants to push all of its contents into the aorta, but it cannot, so because the aortic valve is closed. So what the aorta can do is it can contract really hard in order to increase the pressure within itself, in order to be able later to open the aortic valve. But what is happening first is that there is an isovolumetric contraction. So at first, both valves, both the inlets and the outlets are closed, and the muscular wall is contracting, so it is increasing the pressure but no change in the volume, so there is isovolumetric contraction. So on the graph, after the mitral valve closes, here we go, we have the isovolumetric contraction. So the isovolumetric contraction, as we see, there is an upward going arrow, which means we are increasing the left ventricular pressure, okay? But we are not doing anything with the volume over here because there is no change in the volume. There is only a change in the pressure until the pressure in the left ventricle goes really high, high enough to be able to push open the aortic valve over here. So now the aortic valve is going to open. So this is the point where the aortic valve opens. So when the aortic valve opens, that means the heart can keep contracting hard enough and pushes all of the contents of the blood to the outside through the aorta into the systemic circulation. And now we get less blood inside the left ventricle because it's being pushed out because the outlet is open. So this is what happens. This is the contraction. This is the systole of the left ventricle until the aortic valve decides to close because the heart has emptied the majority of its content into the aorta. But of course, we said that there is a remaining amount of blood that does not leave the left ventricle and it stays within the left ventricle and never leaves it. So now looking at this, the left ventricle has emptied all of its content and now it's nearly except for this amount of blood, it's nearly empty. So now the aortic valve closes in order to not let the blood that has just went out to flow back and cause a problem. So now the blood that went back into the aorta, went to the aorta, cannot flow back into the left ventricle. So that's why the left ventricle closes. So now the left ventricle closes and it's kind of empty except for this amount, for this small amount of blood within here. So the left ventricle decides to relax to be prepared for the next incoming filling. So the left ventricle starts to relax, but as we said, both valves right now are closed. None of those is open. So this is a closed compartment where we are reducing the pressure because the wall is relaxing while there's no blood coming in, there is no blood coming out. So this is the isovolumetric relaxation. So there is no change in the volume, but there is a reduction in the pressure. And there you go. The aortic wall closes, as we said. Now the heart starts to relax and the graph goes down actually. So there you go. So the pressure goes down, but the volume does not change. So this is the phase that we have. This is the isovolumetric relaxation until we get to the point now that the left atrium starts building or having enough blood from the systemic circulate from the aortic veins that it will have a high pressure enough to open again the aortic valves and allow the blood to flow again. And that is the filling, the rapid filling and the reduced filling, and then the whole process starts over and over again. So this is a cardiac beat. All of this happens in a cardiac beat. So now it's important to know where this a little bit the small amount of the blood that has stayed in the left ventricle and has never left it, even though after the contraction of the ventricle, even though after opening the aorta and the majority of blood leaves, but there is still this small amount. This smallest amount is this. It is represented over here that it does not go in the cardiac cycle. So it does not go when the heart does its cardiac beat. So it stays within the heart, okay? So it is called end systolic volume, and here it is. This is how it's represented, because it's called end systolic volume because this is the volume of the blood that stays in the heart after the end of systole. After that, the left ventricle has cleared all of its content, and now the aortic valve is closed, but still this one just stays there and does not leave. So it's called the volume that stays at the end of diastole. That's why it's called the end diastolic volume. And then we have the end systolic volume. Actually, this was end systolic volume. So it's the amount of blood that stays at the end of systole. So it's end systolic volume. For the end diastolic volume, it looks like this. Uh, the end diastolic volume, we can know it just by looking at this graph. It's the amount of blood that actually fills the left ventricle at the end of diastole. So the left ventricle keeps filling by the rapid filling and by the reduced filling. We have them over here. So this is the rapid filling, this is the reduced filling, and that means the amount of blood, like the whole amount of blood that comes into the left ventricle from the left atrium, and they fill up the left ventricle. So when the mitral valve closes, over here, the mitral valve closes. So this is the amount of blood that, except for this has stayed from the previous contraction, but then this pink color is the new amount of blood that has came from the left atrium and then did not leave the heart yet, did not leave the left ventricle yet. So it is the amount of blood that stayed in the left ventricle after the diastole, after the relaxation of the heart, after the filling of the heart. And here's how it's represented. So it is the end diastolic volume over here. Okay, so it's also important to know that the amount of blood that is being ejected, only the amount of blood that is being pushed to the outside of the heart over here is called the stroke volume. So it's not the amount that is staying, it's only the amount that is being pushed and is actually leaving the left ventricle. It's called the stroke volume. So it's the amount of blood leaving the heart. So the amount of blood is leaving the heart is basically the difference between how much has stayed in the ventricle after the relaxation, and then the amount of blood that has stayed after the contraction. So there is the isovolumetric, actually not isovolumetric, actually this is the stroke volume. I'm talking about the stroke volume. So this is the stroke volume, okay? This is the amount of blood that is leaving the heart. It's what happens between the amount of blood during the relaxation of the heart, like during the isovolumetric relaxation, and the amount of blood during the isovolumetric contraction. So it's between these two lines. So this is the stroke volume. So these are the basics of the cardiac cycle, but they are like they are subjective to changes under different circumstances. Okay, let me, no, I need this. Let me clear up all this mess. Okay. So now what happens with this a brown color? Okay, so if, for example, there is any reason or any cause that we are increasing the contractility of the heart, so if you think about it, we are only increasing the ability of the heart to contract, okay? So we are not changing anything like the heart rate, not the amount of blood that is in the systemic circulation that is coming back or flowing out, nothing, but we are only increasing the contractility of the heart. So what happens is, let's go through the whole process. The first, the mitral valve opens. So we decided that now the left ventricle is having a higher contractility. So the left ventricle, the mitral valve opens, the blood flows from the left atrium into the left ventricle, and now it fills the left ventricle. And of course, it meets with the amount of blood that has left from the previous heartbeat. So now the whole blood is in here. And the aortic valve is closed. So after a while, the mitral valve also closes. There you go. So before, okay, let me talk about these over here. So we said that the mitral valve opens. There you go. Let me open the mitral valve. If the mitral valve opens, then it allows all of the blood to flow from the left atrium into the left ventricle. This is the left atrium, this is the left ventricle, as we said, and then now his blood is filling. So this is the this brown line. It's the filling of the uh, left ventricle via two mechanisms, via the rapid filling and via the reduced filling. So now the left ventricle is closed. We will get to the point where the mitral valve closes. Okay, now we are done with the filling. So the mitral valve does close over here. Okay, so the left ventricle, meanwhile, now it's time to contract. It's time for its child to open the aorta in order to eject the blood. So we are increasing the contractility, but without any change in the volume, because the outlets and the inlets are both closed, so there is no way for the blood to leave. So we know that this is called the isovolumetric contraction, and there you go, the brown line. Now we're following the brown line. There is an isovolumetric contraction. So after a while, this contraction is hard enough to push open the aortic valve. So now the aortic valve opens, okay? And this is it. The aortic valve opens. Now we're following the brown line, as we said. So now the heart keeps pushing until it pushes the majority of its content to the outside, into the aorta, into the systemic circulation, into the whole body. So of course, this is the systole. This is the contraction of the left ventricle, and this is represented by this brown graph going actually a little bit longer than the black previous line that we talked about. And why is that? Because now we have some extra force in the wall of the left ventricle, because we said this time we made something special. Now we increase the contractility of the left ventricle. So increasing the contractility of the left ventricle makes it better at ejecting the blood. So now it's ejecting all of the blood within it, and at the same time it's ejecting a small amount, or like a part of the blood that was already there, because now the ventricle is stronger, it has a higher contractility, so now it ejects all of the usual amount that it usually does, and in addition to that, it's strong enough to push out just amount, like a part of the amount of blood that usually stays in the heart. So that's why now it goes a little bit longer. So it goes to this point where the aortic valve closes. Now the aortic valve does this and it closes. Okay, but of course, meanwhile, the left ventricle has emptied all of its content, in addition to a small part. Let me delete this. Now it's a really smaller part that has stayed in the heart. Like this is the amount of the heart, of the blood that stayed in the left ventricle after the emptying of the left ventricle. So we know that this amount is called the end systolic volume. So it's the amount that stayed at the end of systole. And there you go. The amount of the end systolic volume is over here. So now it's less than the usual because it decreased. It went to the left side of the graph. So that means now the amount of blood that has stayed in the heart after the systole is less. So that's why the end systolic volume is less. And now, of course, this is the isovolumetric relaxation. There you go. This is the isovolumetric relaxation. We're following the brown line. So the brown line goes down because there is no change in the amounts of blood, but there is a change or reduction in the pressure, of course. So, and then the whole circle starts again, all over again, by opening of the mitral valve and allowing the blood to flow, and then fill up the left ventricle. The whole process starts all over again. For the stroke volume, now we know that this black line is the normal, but now because we increase the contractility of the left ventricle, that means the stroke volume is getting higher. Is actually there is much more stroke volume, much more amount of blood leaving the left ventricle. That's why it's called a higher stroke volume, and we can actually see the difference. So the yellow line is the normal, and then this red line is the new stroke volume because of increasing the contractility. And this is why there is increased stroke volume, there is increased ejection fraction. They're basically kind of the same. And then there is decrease in the end-systolic volume, and there you go. This is why there is a decrease, because we said the stroke end-systolic volume goes all over the way here. So yeah. Now let's look at the other variable. If we have done something to change the preload. Okay, so let me delete all of this. Okay, so increasing the preload, it's the green circle now that we're looking at. So basically increasing the preload means increasing the amount of blood that has reached the left atrium, for example. So it's basically the increasing the amount of blood that has filled the left atrium and now needs to move forward and fill the left ventricle. So the amount of blood that the left ventricle is going to receive is higher than usual. So what happens is, at first, so this is the left ventricle that we know, and of course it has a small amount of blood that has stayed in it from the previous contraction, from the previous cardiac beat. So now the mitral valve opens. Okay, mitral valve opens, allowing this blood to move forward, okay, and allowing the left ventricle to be filled. But because this amount of blood in the left atrium is too much, that means that means the mitral valve is going to stay open for a longer time because it's waiting for all this blood to pass through. So now it's allowing all of this blood to pass through, and all of it comes in here within the left ventricle. So there you go. There is of course, there is rapid filling and there is reduced filling. These are something to know, like for all with that happens with all of the variables. So the filling, there you go. We are following the green line now. The mitral valve opens, allowing these ventricles to be the left ventricle to be filled out. But now it's filling more than the usual expected amount. So it's filling more than the black line over here. So this is where now the mitral valve closes. Now all of this blood has moved into the left atrium. So now the left ventricle, the mitral valve decides to close. And we know meanwhile that the aorta is closed. So now the left ventricle undergoes the isovolumetric contraction, so starts contracting without a change in the volume, only change in the pressure. Now we are able to open the, so this is the isometric contraction. This is how it looks like, following the green line, okay? And this is where the aortic valve open. There you go. It moves this way. So now the aortic valve opens, and now we are allowing the heart to move out of the left ventricle, and then this is the ejection of the heart, this is the systole, and here it looks like this. Oh, there you go. We're following the green line. So this is by increasing the preload, because we have increased the amount of blood that went into the left ventricle. So it keeps moving like this. This is where it gets where the aortic valve closed. Now the heart has emptied all of its content, except for this amount of blood that does not leave the heart, and now the aortic valve closes. So, because the aortic valve closes, then the contraction goes into relaxation, and the heart muscle starts to relax, and but actually without any actual change in the volume. So this is the isovolumetric relaxation, and following the green line, the isovolumetric relaxation goes this way. And we know that there is a change in the pressure, reduction in pressure, but actually no change in the volume. So this is the point where the mitral valve opens again, and the whole process starts all over again. So all of the blood moves back into the left ventricle, and the whole process goes on all over again. So if we take a look at the what happened here, we said because we increase the preload, that means the amount of blood that fills the heart is more than expected, more than the usual. So the amount of blood that stays at the end of this filling, like at the diastole, um, is more than expected. So the end diastolic volume, if you like, take a look over here, it's more than expected. So this is the normal expected end diastolic volume. This is the new end diastolic volume. This is new amount that has stays at the end of the left ventricular filling. And for the stroke volume, we know that the normal stroke volume is this black line between the usual sides of the black normal cardiac cycle. But because we have increased the preload, that the new amount that is leaving the heart is even more as well. So the stroke volume is more, because it makes sense. We have filled the left ventricle with more blood, so of course more blood is leaving the left ventricle as well. So more in, more out. So that's why we see the stroke volume more than the usual stroke volume. So that's for the second variable. The third variable, and that is actually the last one over here. Clear up this mess. So this is our nice heart with the amount of blood that stays after each contraction. Now we're going to follow the blue line, that is increasing the afterload. So increasing the afterload means increasing something over here, either with the aorta or with the aortic valve. That means increasing the pressure that the left ventricle needs to push against. So now it's harder for the left ventricle to push against the aortic valve or against the aorta. Let's say someone has a very high blood pressure, high blood pressure. So that means the aorta is tough, or or someone has an aortic stenosis. Like, it's really hard for the left ventricle to push through the aorta, through the aortic valve. So that means increasing the afterload, so that we are increasing the resistance of to the left ventricular contraction. So let's do the whole process again. Let's go over the blue line. So the blue line, let's say we have uh, starts by opening the mitral valves and allowing the blood to flow into the left ventricle. So until the left ventricle really fills to a point that it needs to open the this was closed. So now the left ventricle needs to open the aortic valve. Okay, let me do these one by one. Okay, let me do these one by one. Okay, okay. So what we have is that closed aorta, and then there is a blood in the left atrium, okay, that needs to go into the left ventricle, okay? So now, of course, the mitral valve opens, allowing this blood, allowing the ventricular filling. And we know the ventricular filling goes on in two phases: rapid filling and then reduced filling. So these are fine. So if we take a look at the blue line over here, the mitral valve, okay, this is mitral valve closure. There is filling over here. We're going to say why that the filling is less than usual. So there is filling of two phases of rapid filling and then reduced filling. Okay, now the left ventricle is having more blood, more blood, more blood, until then there is no need to add more. The mitral valve closes. Okay, And this is what we see over here. This is the mitral valve closes. So of course, the left, now there is no inlet, there is no outlet. The left ventricle starts contracting, trying to push the blood outside of it, but actually both the inlets and the outlets are closed. So this is what we call the isovolumetric contraction. Okay, so the isovolumetric contraction this time goes a little bit higher than expected. So there you go, mitral valve closed. We're following the blue line. It goes much higher than the regular black line. Why is that? Because even though the muscular wall is contracting, it is still having a difficulty of pushing the aortic valve open, because the aortic valve is either stenosed or the aorta has a very high pressure within it. So it's really, really hard for the left ventricle, even though it's pushing hard. So it's really hard for it to push the blood to the outside. That's why the contraction phase, the isovolumetric contraction, the amount um, of time that the left ventricle needs to keep contracting is increased. So we see there is an increase in the pressure, but the aortic valve is still not open. The aortic valve is still closed, but the left ventricle keeps pushing and pushing hard and pushing hard and pushing hard until it increases its own pressure um, high enough to be able to finally push open the aorta, finally push open the aortic valve. And of course, after there you go, here is the aortic valve opening. Now it becomes this way because it's so hard now to open the aortic valve. So it takes harder power to open the aortic valve. Then, of course, there we need to start ejecting the blood to the outside, okay? So, and that's fine, it happens, but it happens only for a short amount of time because let's say the aortic valve was stenosed. So because the aortic valve has stenosed or the patient has a high blood pressure, we still have a higher afterload. So the left ventricle cannot just keep pushing, it needs to be relaxed. So this time the aortic valve is going to close sooner than expected because it's either stenosed or it does have a problem, or the aorta has a very high pressure, so it's just closing the aortic valve sooner. So the phase of ejecting the blood into the aorta is going to be shorter, okay, because the outlet doors are going to be closed soon. So this is the ejection phase, and it's quite obvious that is much lower than, or actually much less in time uh, than the normal regular black circle. So so this is, instead of closing the aortic valve here, now the aortic valve closes really fast. So this is the new aortic valve closure. Okay. So this is the systole, and it's really short because the left ventricle is having a really hard time pushing. So even though it's pushing hard, it just we have a problem with the aortic valve or with the aorta. So that's why, of course, because the amount of blood that leaves the heart now has to leave very fast. So there is a higher amount or a bigger amount, a bigger volume that stays in the left ventricle. So there is now more blood staying in the left ventricle and not leaving, and this is the end systolic volume. Instead of staying here, actually now it stays over here, and this is the problem because now we have so much blood staying within the heart after systole. So we have a very high end systolic volume because it went that way. So now, but for stroke volume, the amount of blood that has actually left the heart, that has actually went in the systemic circulation, is much less than expected. So this is the stroke volume. The amount of blood that has actually left the heart is much less than the normal, that should leave the heart normally. That should be it.